What if the one thing you desire the most is the one thing you can never have? Clara had spent her life following the rules, building the perfect facade of a devoted wife and loving mother. But all it took was one moment, one forbidden thought, to send her world spiraling into chaos. Will she fight against it, or will she surrender to the temptation that threatens to consume her? Stay with us, because the deeper this story goes, the harder it will be to look away.
As I wiped away the blood, I felt a strange tension settle between us. Something unspoken, something I refused to acknowledge. But when I pressed the bandage against his skin, he winced, and without thinking, I reached up, brushing his hair back in a gesture far too familiar. His eyes met mine. For a moment, the air between us felt different, charged with something neither of us could name. I stepped back quickly, suddenly aware of how close we were. "Be more careful next time," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He nodded, looking down, but I knew he had felt it too. And that was the beginning. Looking back, I wonder if I had been waiting for something, anything, to shake me out of the quiet monotony of my life. My marriage to Richard had never been a passionate love affair. We were both older, both coming from failed relationships, both simply looking for stability. And in that, we succeeded. There were no fiery arguments, no dramatic betrayals, just the predictable rhythm of two people sharing a home, a life, but not much else. Richard was a man of habits. He woke early, left for work, spent his weekends on the golf course, and ended his nights with a glass of whiskey and the news. I filled my days with housework, gardening, and charity events, finding comfort in routine. We rarely talked about anything beyond logistics, what needed fixing around the house, what time we were expected at dinner parties, whether the cleaning service should come twice a week instead of once. I had convinced myself that this was enough, that love, the way I once imagined it, was a luxury for the young and reckless, that at my age, contentment was more valuable than passion. And then Nathan arrived. Nathan was Richard's son from his first marriage, though they had never been particularly close. I had met him only a handful of times over the years. Brief encounters at holiday gatherings, where he had always been polite but distant, a stranger wearing the title of Stepson. But now, having just graduated from college and uncertain about his future, Nathan had moved in with us. Richard had insisted it was temporary, just until Nathan found a job. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that he had no real direction yet. He spent most of his time in his room, sketching or reading, emerging occasionally to join me in the kitchen or out in the garden. At first, our conversations were simple. Small talk about the weather, the neighbors, the best place to buy fresh coffee beans. But as the days stretched into weeks, the distance between us began to shrink. He had a way of listening that made me feel seen in a way Richard never had. He noticed the little things, how I liked my tea without sugar, how I always hummed under my breath when arranging flowers, how my hands lingered over old photo albums when I thought no one was watching. It was nothing. And yet, it was everything. The first time I truly noticed him, really noticed him, was on a quiet afternoon in the garden. I had been tending to the roses when Nathan appeared at the doorway, a cup of coffee in hand. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching. "Do you want to help?" I asked, mostly out of politeness. To my surprise, he nodded, setting his coffee down and kneeling beside me. His fingers brushed against mine as he reached for the shears. A fleeting touch, but one that sent an unexpected shiver up my spine. "You love this, don't you?" he asked after a while, nodding toward the flowers. I hesitated before answering. "It's peaceful." He smiled. "I think you like creating beauty." I felt my cheeks warm, though I didn't know why. "And what about you?" You spend all day drawing, but I've never seen your work." He hesitated. "Would you want to?" "Of course." That night, he brought his sketchbook to the dining table. I expected landscapes or portraits, maybe something abstract. Instead, I found page after page of familiar things. My hands arranging silverware, the curve of my shoulder as I leaned over the stove, the way sunlight hit my face through the garden trellis. I should have said something. I should have stopped it right then. But I didn't, and that was my first mistake. It was a warm afternoon when it happened. I had been folding laundry in the living room, the television murmuring in the background, when Nathan walked in. He had just finished his shower, his hair still damp, wearing a casual t-shirt and sweatpants. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Clara," he said, using my name instead of the usual Mom he had forced himself to say around Richard. "Do you mind helping me with something?" I turned, my hand still clutching a freshly folded towel. "Of course. What is it?" He lifted his left wrist, revealing a leather bracelet, worn, frayed at the edges, with a silver clasp that appeared stuck. "It won't come off. I think it's jammed." I set the towel aside and stepped closer, reaching for his wrist. His skin was warm beneath my fingertips as I fiddled with the clasp. "Hold still," I murmured, concentrating. It was an innocent thing, a simple request. But then, as I finally twisted the clasp free, the bracelet slid off, along with the sleeve of his t-shirt, exposing a faint scar along his forearm. I knew I shouldn't ask. I knew it wasn't my place. But before I could stop myself, my fingers traced the mark lightly. "This?" I asked softly. Nathan tensed under my touch. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then with a quiet exhale, he said, "Just something from when I was younger. It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. Not the way his voice lowered. Not the way his eyes flickered with something unspoken. And definitely not the way my heart raced when he looked at me then. Really looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time. I should have stepped back. I should have laughed it off. I should have said something, anything, to break the moment. But I didn't, and that was my second mistake. That night, as Richard slept soundly beside me, I lay still, staring into the darkness, my body rigid with a tension I refused to name. His steady breaths filled the silence, yet they felt a world away. My mind, my pulse, my very being was elsewhere, lost in the lingering ghost of a touch that had never truly been mine to claim. Nathan, the way his fingers had brushed against mine earlier that evening, so fleeting yet so devastatingly intimate, played over and over in my mind. I could still feel the heat of his skin, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, the unspoken hunger in the air between us. It was maddening, intoxicating. A shiver ran down my spine as my hand moved instinctively, tracing the same path his had taken, down my wrist, across the sensitive skin of my inner arm. My breath hitched, my body awakening under the weight of my own longing. I squeezed my thighs together, desperate to chase away the ache, but it was no use. Slowly, hesitantly, I let my fingers slide lower, grazing the swell of my breast, my nipples already taut with anticipation. I imagined it was his hand instead, his lips, his breath hot against my skin. My pulse quickened, the forbidden thrill of it sending a wave of heat through me. My other hand slipped beneath the sheets, trembling, restless. A soft gasp escaped my lips as I let myself surrender to the fantasy, to the way I wished his touch would feel, firm yet tender, demanding yet reverent. My body arched involuntarily, a desperate plea for something more, something real. Guilt should have stopped me. The ring on my finger should have burned against my skin like a brand of betrayal. But in that moment, lost in the haze of desire. Nothing else existed, only the unbearable ache, the delicious torment of wanting a man I could never have. And as the pleasure crested, shattering me in waves of ecstasy, his name trembled on my lips, barely more than a whisper in the night. Nathan. After that, everything changed. We didn't talk about it, but the air between us had shifted. I found myself avoiding him, keeping my distance whenever I could. I spent more time at charity events, busied myself with household chores, even started visiting friends I hadn't seen in months. But the house was too small, the silence too loud. At dinner, I would catch his gaze lingering on me from across the table. In the mornings, I would hear his footsteps pause outside the kitchen before retreating. And every so often, I would feel the heat of his presence behind me, standing just a little too close, his breath just a little too steady. Richard, of course, noticed nothing. He came home late, went straight to his study, sipped his whiskey, and asked nothing of me beyond the routine pleasantries of married life. But Nathan was everywhere. And worse, I wanted him to be. One evening, after Richard had gone to bed early, I found Nathan sitting outside on the patio, a cigarette burning lazily between his fingers. "You don't smoke," I said, stepping outside. He glanced at me, exhaling a slow stream of smoke. "I don't." I hesitated before lowering myself onto the chair beside him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The night air was thick, heavy with unsaid words. Then quietly, he said, "About the other day." I stiffened. "We don't have to talk about it." "But I want to." I turned to look at him. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw tight, his fingers tapping against his knee. "It wasn't just a moment for me," he admitted. "It wasn't nothing." I swallowed hard. "Nathan." He finally turned to face me then, his expression unreadable. "Was it nothing for you?" My breath caught in my throat. I should have said yes. I should have laughed, dismissed it, made it clear that whatever he thought he felt was a misunderstanding. But I didn't, because it wasn't nothing. And that was my third mistake. The first kiss was a mistake. Or at least that's what I told myself afterward. It was late. Later than it should have been for us to be sitting together in the dark, with only the distant hum of crickets and the soft glow of the garden lights surrounding us. I had been ready to leave, to put an end to whatever this was before it spiraled further. But then Nathan reached for my wrist, his grip firm, yet hesitant. "Stay," he murmured. And I did. I don't remember who leaned in first. All I remember is the warmth of his breath against my skin, the way my body betrayed me, even as my mind screamed at me to stop. And then his lips brushed against mine, soft, fleeting, a question more than a demand. I could have pulled away. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. And that was the moment I knew there was no turning back. We were careful. At least, we tried to be. It started with fleeting touches, a brush of fingers as we passed in the hallway, a lingering glance when Richard wasn't looking. Then, stolen moments, a whispered conversation in the kitchen when everyone else was asleep, the warmth of his hand at the small of my back as I reached for something on a high shelf. The way his lips would sometimes ghost over my temple when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Every time I told myself it would be the last. Every time I failed. Richard remained oblivious, lost in his own world. And Nathan became my world. I knew it couldn't last. I knew it was dangerous. But I also knew that, for the first time in years, I felt alive. And that was the biggest mistake of all. I had always believed that secrets were meant to be buried deep, hidden beneath layers of silence. But some secrets refused to stay buried. Some clawed their way to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged, daring to be unraveled. It started with stolen glances, lingering touches, and an undeniable tension that thickened the air whenever Nathan and I were alone. My son, but not in the way the world saw him. He was Richard's illegitimate child, taken in and raised as our own. And yet, every time I looked at him, I felt something stirring within me that I dared not name. It was wrong. It was madness. But it was also intoxicating. One evening, when Richard was away on business, I found myself alone with Nathan in the dimly lit study. The fire cast flickering shadows across his sharp features, his eyes burning with something I could not decipher, or perhaps refused to. "Mother," he murmured, his voice laced with something almost dangerous. "You've been avoiding me." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. "Nonsense," I lied, though we both knew the truth. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. I could smell the faint scent of sandalwood clinging to his skin, feel the heat radiating from his body. The tension was suffocating, and yet neither of us moved. I broke first, fleeing the room like a coward, my heart hammering against my ribs. The secrecy only heightened the tension. Every whispered conversation, every accidental touch, every unsaid word became a game of restraint and desire. Richard, oblivious as ever, continued his routine without question. But I could feel the weight of Nathan's gaze from across the room. The danger of it made my skin tingle. The thrill of being on the edge of something so forbidden, yet so consuming, was unlike anything I had ever felt. But fear lurked in the corners of my mind. If Richard ever suspected. And then, one night, I caught him watching us. Richard's eyes lingered on Nathan and me longer than usual at dinner. His brow furrowed as if trying to piece together an invisible puzzle. I forced a smile, engaging in meaningless conversation. But my hands trembled as I lifted my wine glass. Nathan, ever composed, met Richard's gaze head-on. "Father, is something the matter?" he asked smoothly. Richard's lips thinned. "No," he said after a pause. "Nothing at all." But I knew better. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside Richard, his arm draped over my waist, I felt suffocated. My thoughts drifted to Nathan. His hands, his voice, the way he looked at me with something I refused to acknowledge. I bit my lip, my body betraying me as a heat spread through my veins. I turned away from Richard, shame burning in my chest. Claire, ever the meddler, arrived unannounced a week later. She was sharp, perceptive, and far too observant for my comfort. "You seem tense," she remarked over tea, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And Nathan, well, he's become quite the young man, hasn't he?" I forced a laugh. "I suppose so." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Careful, dear. Secrets have a way of unraveling." I gripped my teacup so tightly I thought it might crack. The walls were closing in. Ryan, Nathan's closest confidant, had started to look at me differently, his curiosity barely veiled behind polite words. "Are you and Nathan close, Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked one afternoon. I kept my voice steady. "Of course, he is my son." Ryan smiled, but there was something knowing in his gaze. The unease only grew. Nathan became restless, his patience thinning. "We cannot keep doing this," he said one evening, his voice tight. I turned away. "There is nothing to stop." His hand closed around my wrist, firm yet gentle. "Lying to yourself won't make it any less real." The night of the gala, Claire decided to strike. As we stood amidst the glittering chandeliers and flowing champagne, she leaned in close to Richard and whispered something in his ear. His expression darkened, his gaze flickering to Nathan and me. The air grew heavy, The unspoken accusations swirled between us like a brewing storm. I held my breath, waiting for the strike. Nathan remained composed, his mask unshaken. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight clench of his jaw. And then Richard set down his glass with deliberate slowness. "We need to talk," he said. I could feel my world crumbling as I followed Richard into his study. The door closed behind us with a heavy thud. "I'm not a fool, Clara," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Tell me the truth." Panic surged through me. The truth? The truth would destroy everything. Nathan was waiting outside. I could feel his presence, his silent plea through the thick wooden door. There was no turning back now. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and the only question left was, would we survive it?
This is just the beginning. Clara's choices will lead her down a path where every step is more dangerous than the last. Secrets will unravel, emotions will ignite, and consequences will be inevitable. Don't miss what happens next. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you're the first to know when the next episode drops. Trust us, you won't want to be left behind.